But I'm okay. are you sitting?
When she
wherever you're Karen is our program officer.
Oh, Karen, how are you? Nice to meet you too. Oh, okay. Have you heard of Vicarious?
Yes, yes, of course.
In good way or bad way? Of course. We're bringing yeah. So Karen? Yes. So is that it? So you're with the casting and stuff?
She's retired.
No, I mean,
Yeah.
other side of the thing. We're doing wonderful things. So we're together, so we have a good group of advisors.
Has been involved with the mental health project before. Okay. Press the eye.
think we're going to kick off in about a minute. So if people can start to take their seats, and I'm going to make things difficult for those of you that are sitting at tables by yourself. Can everyone hear me, first of all? I hate using microphones because I feel like Tony Robbins whenever I use them. I probably need the microphone? Okay. Yeah? Okay. So unfortunately I need to use a microphone, so everyone can hear me though, right? So I'm going to make things difficult for those of you that are sitting by yourselves or sitting with only one or two, because there are going to be components throughout the day where you might have to work together with people. That means you're going to have to move tables. Doesn't mean you have to move right now, but when we do get to those components of the workshop, we're going to have to do some rejigging of some of the tables. That's absolutely okay. As long as you have 3 at a table, then you're safe, and more than 3 is excellent. We'll give it another minute because I know there's about 5 people I think we're still waiting on. 15 minutes? Oh. Okay, we've got about a dozen people. Yeah, okay. Okay. Okay, yeah, no problem. That's okay, yeah, absolutely. hopefully more people trickle in. You have about a dozen, I think, waiting or we're waiting on. But I'd like to know a bit more about you before you know more about me. And we're not going to go one by one because there is a recording being done. But just so that I have a sense of who's in the room, how many people here work with community service providers? So that might be organizations supporting immigrants, newcomers, refugees. Okay, excellent. And of that group, how many of you are entirely volunteer-based? You don't have paid employees? Is there anyone here that does not have paid employees? Okay. Anyone here from government, whether municipal, provincial, or federal? Okay. Anyone here from, not from an organization, but here just because they're interested in the topic? Okay. So how many of you have direct reports? So people that report to you, your managers, supervisors, leaders at your organizations in some capacity? Okay, and how many of you are frontline staff, no direct reports, but you work directly with clients? Okay, so quite a few of you. So today we're going to talk about 4 topics. The first is on secondary traumatic stress or vicarious trauma and compassion fatigue. After this, we're going to talk about low mood and depression, right? So those disorders and those experiences that exist along that affective spectrum. We're going to break for lunch. And then we're going to come back, talk about stress and anxiety, and finally psychological health and safety. Not just from a national perspective, so we're going to discuss the national standard for psychological health and safety, but we're also going to talk about some of the regulations here in Ontario that are going to be particularly relevant to you as community service providers here in Ontario, particularly the Accessible Employment Standard and the AODA, right? Because those are the 2 most relevant really when we talk about mental health from an employment perspective. And then certainly tangentially we'll talk a little bit about the Mental Health Act, and I'll be able to answer any of your questions that do arise as we discuss psychological health and safety. Throughout the day, there are going to be components and moments in which we're going to participate together, because I don't want you just sitting there getting sleepy. So rather than having you do jumping jacks, we'll do some role playing, because everyone loves role playing, right? How many people here love role playing? Yeah, none of you do. I know that already. But it's important to do. And we'll do some other activities. And in addition to that, if you do have a question, I don't want you to wait to ask the question, okay? So I don't want you to wait till the end, because first of all, you'll forget the question that you were going to ask probably, unless you're really keen and write it down. But also I want this to be a bit more of an open discussion rather than just me talking at you, right? We're going to have a conversation together. So my name is Lawrence. I'm from the Canadian Mental Health Association Ontario Division, and I'm the project manager for a program that we run called Mental Health Works. It's nationwide in scope, so we have about 70 trainers across the entire country, as well as trainers down in the United States with Mental Health America, both out of California and New York State. And we do capacity building workshops predominantly in workplaces, right? So I always have a lot of fun when I'm going into a training session and I get to decide, okay, am I wearing a suit and tie today, or am I wearing like a polo shirt or jeans and a plaid shirt, depending on the organization. Don't know if I hit the mark today, but we'll see. I've been doing this for about 2 years. So I've been with CMHA for 2 years with this program, and prior to this with the Human Services and Justice Coordinating Committee. And prior to CMHA, I was in the Canadian military. So I was an infantry officer. I came here to conduct research for my doctorate and worked full-time here at Brigade and Divisional Headquarters. My last job, when I was working full-time with the military, I'm still in a part-time capacity with our militia, I worked on Operation Provision. Operation Provision was the evacuation of over 30,000 Syrian refugees from Lebanon and Jordan predominantly. And I was the liaison officer for 32 Brigade that worked with the IRCC and witnessed, probably by my count, close to 15,000 individuals get off a plane and set foot in Canada for the first time. And that was pretty powerful. The reason I worked on that, the reason I volunteered for it, is because my doctorate is working with refugees. Mostly the Somali community here in Toronto. And I look at the experiences of trauma and separation, the refugee experience, and how that affects participation in a host community or in a new community, and predominantly youth. So if you have questions about these kind of topics, hopefully I'm equipped to talk to them or speak to those questions. If I don't have the answer for you though, I'm going to write it down because I have a notebook, and I will get back to you with the answer. okay? Or someone who knows the answer and can speak to it better than I can. So without further ado, why we're here? Well, we're going to start off with a conversation around vicarious trauma. And just get a sense, how many people here have heard about vicarious trauma before? Or secondary traumatic stress, okay? Or compassion fatigue. A lot of community service workers are going to have heard of compassion fatigue. Well, the reality, just before we get into a really in-depth conversation about what it is that 1 in 5 Canadians will experience a mental health problem each year. Okay? So about 20% of the population is going to experience a mental health concern, a mental illness. It doesn't mean that they've necessarily been diagnosed with a mental illness, but they've certainly hit the clinical threshold for a potential diagnosis, right? And 1 in 3 in their lifetimes. So about a third of us will experience a mental health concern at some point in time. Again, meet the threshold for clinical diagnosis, but not necessarily be diagnosed, right? We've probably all had moments in our lives or spans of time throughout our lives where maybe we were depressed, right? Experiencing depression. Maybe we were experiencing an anxiety disorder. Maybe we were experiencing something a bit more serious, perhaps a substance use disorder or an addiction, whether process-based or substance-based. And we just weren't aware of it, right? We lacked insight into our condition, or we were too afraid to go to a doctor and say, I think there's something going on, right? So that 1 in 3 doesn't necessarily mean that they're getting help. It means that they're just meeting that threshold. 500,000 people don't show up to work every week, right? This is particularly a problem in our organizations, in community service organizations. We do a lot of hard work, emotionally taxing work, and that has a toll, and that has an iterative effect that compounds upon itself when we go back into the office, right? So it becomes harder and harder to show up to work because of the kind of work that we do. 30% of all disability claims are related to mental illness, directly a result of mental illness or a substance use concern. But that 30%, 70% of all costs, right? Does anyone have an idea of why that would be? Why 70% of all disability-related costs are related to mental illness? You can raise your hand. This is like close to a free-for-all. No one? No. So part of the reason for that is because we wait too long to get help, right? Or to receive treatment. So I've broken my hand a couple times. The last time, it's not a cool story. I was playing volleyball and I volleyed the ball wrong and I snapped a finger, or a bone in one of my fingers. But I went to the doctor pretty much right away because my hand blew up. It looked like, you know, those big mitts that you wear at a baseball game and you wave with the one, right? My hand looked like that and it's swollen up pretty spectacularly. And I went to the emergency room, right? And the doctor saw me after about 6 hours of waiting and said, okay, we're going to splint your finger and give you some pills to take the swelling down and just send you home, right? It was a pretty simple process. What do you think would have happened if I had waited for 6 months? What would the doctor have said? Just shut it out. Yeah, you're an idiot. Why didn't you come in earlier, right? Like that's what the doctor would have said, right? And then they would have had to break my hand again if it had set in properly. I would have been in a lot more pain. Recovery would have been longer, right? I would have had to go to physio probably, all these different things. So why do we do that with mental health and mental illness, right? Why do we do that? Why do we wait and wait and wait when we know there might be a problem or we know there might be a concern before we see someone about it? And there's really 2 reasons. Yep.
Social stigma.
Yeah, good, right? So social stigma.
Denial.
Denial, good. Could be denial, could also be what we call a lack of insight, right? So sometimes people experience a lack of insight when it comes to their mental health, which means it could be a process-related lack of insight. So, for example, in the context of something like formal thought disorder and schizophrenia, or it could be something just they're not aware that the feelings that they're feeling are actually a mental health concern or mental illness, right?
It could be lack of resources as well.
Lack of resources, excellent. Yeah, where do you go, right? The mental health system is probably one of the hardest systems to navigate, right? Where do you go to get initial treatment or initial help? I saw a hand over here.
It's mostly invisible.
Invisible, right? So mental illness, for the most part, is an invisible illness. You can't just tell by looking at someone if they're experiencing mental illness, right? And I know people argue, well, maybe you can't. But no, you can't, right? Just because someone looks a certain way doesn't mean that they're not experiencing mental illness, or just because they look a certain way, they might not experience mental illness at all. They just like to dress that way or like to act that way, right? So it is an invisible illness. So those are all great answers. Those are some of the reasons as to why we don't get help. And what happens is when we do reach out for help, or finally we decide to talk to someone about it, oftentimes we can no longer work. Right? And this is why when we take a look at the disability-related costs for mental illness, they're astronomically high. Right? So in Canada, we lose about $51 billion annually from the economy because of mental illness. By 2025, this is going to reach into the roughly $70 billion. Here in Ontario, that equals out to what, 20 to 30 billion. Right? Lost from the economy, was evaporated because of mental illness and substance use concerns. So what can we do, right, as community service providers, as employers of individuals, as community workers who help to find people employment, right? Well, the first is that we can engage people in solutions. If I brought in my friend Joe is made up of, okay, so no one named Joe, but Joe has cancer, and I introduced him to you, and I said, this is my friend Joe, he's cancer riddled. What would you think of me? You probably wouldn't think very highly of me, right? If I was introducing you to my friend Joe, and I called him cancer riddled, right? You'd think, why is this person speaking to us? I don't want to listen to him anymore. We don't tend to do that with physical illness or physical disabilities anymore. We do it all the time with mental illness, right? Oh, that person's manic depressive. That person's crazy. That person's a junkie. That person's insane, right? That person's a schizophrenic, right? We label people as the illness, or we treat them as problems, right? Instead of treating them as people. So if we start to engage people in solutions, right? Engage people in their own treatment, adopt a person-centric approach to mental health and mental illness, we're going to see better results because people are actually going to want to engage in treatment. It's not going to be as prescriptive. We can allow people to feel heard and respected, right? Just talking to someone and saying, hey, I might not understand what you're going through, but I care about you, and I understand that this is very painful, can go a long way, right? One of the worst things you can do is if someone is experiencing an addictions concern or severe mental health concern and you haven't experienced that, don't say, I understand what you're going through, right? Say, I understand this is really difficult and I want to be here for you, right? We can increase feelings of trust, security, and value. This becomes particularly important when we talk about later in the day psychological health and safety. And I speak to one of the 13 psychosocial factors of the national standard, which is organizational culture, right? So the culture at your organizations is going to be predicated upon three things. Those things are trust, honesty, and fairness. That's felt between employees and managers, or employees and the employer, but also your clients and the organization itself, right? And if you have those three things, you're well on your way to having a great organizational culture. We can reduce or eliminate barriers or risks of harm. So, how many people here have done WMIS training before? You should all be raising your hands, by the way. It's mandated in the province of Ontario. If you haven't done WMIS training at your current organization, go to them and say, I got to do WMIS training. So the Workplace Hazardous Information Materials System, right? We all do it so that when we get bleach in our eye or we spill something on our skin that's under the sink, we know where to go on the material safety data sheet and say, okay, I got to flush the eye, or I got to call poison control, or don't put water on this thing, put something else on it. We do that in order to mitigate the risk of harm produced by substances that might exist in the workplace, right? It doesn't mean that all our workplaces have like chlorine in them or tritium, radioactive tritium. It doesn't mean that our workplaces have these things in them, but most workplaces have bleach or some kind of drain cleaner, right? Some cleaning products that are corrosive, right? Or if ingested might be poisonous. So we do WMIS training in order to mitigate the risk of harm that's caused by those substances. We do a very poor job of this when it comes to psychological health and safety, right? So an example of maybe mitigating risk would be if you're a paramedic and you regularly attend critical accidents on the 400 series highways, which is some pretty horrific car wrecks. Maybe after you attend one of those incidents, you don't go right back onto your patrol, you have to speak to a social worker, right? So that would be an example of mitigating the risk of harm from attending critical accidents on the 400 series highways, as opposed to eliminating it, right? Because if you're a paramedic, you can't eliminate the risk that might be posed by trauma, right? You can't eliminate that. So we can at least try to mitigate the risk. And then finally, we can support health and safety. If you worked in a place that you didn't feel physically safe, do you think your mental health would be good? No, right? You'd probably have a pretty a rough go with that. So you'd probably be anxious, stressed, right? There'd be some reactions occurring within your interactions with others that are affected by them, right? So just by supporting health and safety and having a healthy workplace from a physical perspective, that contributes to good mental health, right? So when I talk about mental health, when I talk about mental illness, I like to talk about 3 components of it, right? So 3 components of health. And the first is obviously our physical health. So physical health is, how we eat, how much we exercise, the kind of environment we live in. What are some indicators of good physical health that just come to mind? I'm going to start telling people to raise their hands. Okay, how about something from this table? An indicator of good physical health.
Physical health is good energy, active, be happy, eating well.
Okay, eating well, happy with your physical activity levels, being able to engage in the things that you normally like to engage in, right?
Sleep well.
Sleeping well, that's excellent, yeah. Some people like to sleep a lot, some people don't sleep a lot, right? What else? What's another indicator? Yeah.
Having energy during the day.
Having energy during the day, right? So just that physical energy, that ability to keep going. Absolutely. What else? Yeah.
I'd say functionality, like functioning in a normal way.
Okay, yeah, so functioning in a way that's not 2 standard deviations outside the mean, right? If we want to get really scientific about it. But yeah, absolutely, right? So functioning in a way that's you're able to enjoy life, essentially, right? That's normal for you. Anything else? Yeah.
A good place to stay.
Say again?
Like a good home to stay.
A good home to stay. Yeah, so that's probably more relevant to what we're going to talk about next, but absolutely, right? Having shelter, having food, those kind of things. So is physical health the same for everyone, though? No, right? So people are going to be different. If I have diabetes and it's treated with insulin and regular exercise, am I physically unhealthy? No. If I had something like lupus or scleroderma, so like an autoimmune condition, but it's well controlled with medication and certain therapies, do I have poor physical health? No, right? I probably don't. I probably have pretty good physical health. It doesn't mean that I don't have a chronic illness or maybe a disability, but I can still have great physical health, right? The next is social health, right? So in order to be healthy human beings, we need good social interaction. So what are some indicators of social health? Or what would contribute to good social health? Yeah? Yeah, positive relationships. So having people that love you, loving other people, having relationships that are meaningful, right? That give you joy, right? That aren't taxing or exhausting or toxic. We heard earlier housing and food, right? Those are indicators of good social health. One of the things that we notice from a mental health perspective is when we go to communities that are isolated, right? Or individuals that have been isolated for extended periods of time, like with prison populations, those who have experienced solitary confinement for extended periods, they tend to have a very poor state of mental health. Right? And the reason for that is because they're not engaging in social interactions regularly with other people. We're social beings. We need to have social interactions in order to be healthy. Right? And then finally, mental health. Right? So what are some indicators of good mental health? Bueller? No? How about this table right here? An indicator of good mental health. Yeah?
I think it's a balance between having like a good social and physical life.
Good. Okay, so balance.
Yeah.
Balance is pretty key. Is it the absence of stress? Sorry?
Stress is always there.
Stress is always good. So, but we have to make a differentiation, and we'll certainly talk about this later on today. There's good stress and bad stress, right? And you never want to live a life where you don't experience any stress, because then you'd be very interesting from a clinical perspective. I know researchers that would probably love to talk to you if you never experienced stress, right? But stress is it's never always a bad thing, right? I saw a hand over here.
Oh, I was going to say managing that stress.
Managing stress. So what do we call that?
Coping.
Coping, okay? Or resiliency. There, that's what I was looking for. Excellent, right? So resiliency, it's like a muscle. It's something that we have to exercise in order to actually get good at it, right? So if we're resilient, if we achieve balance, right, if we feel as though we're on an even keel, that we're not flipping back and forth into what we would call affective mood states, right? So our mood is well regulated, our thought patterns are well regulated, we're not experiencing intrusive or ruminative thoughts regularly, that's probably an indicator of good mental health, right? And if we're able to engage in the things that matter to us, whether it's physical activity or social interactions, that's a good indicator of good mental health as well. The one thing that's left out here, right, so obviously this is the CMHA logo, the one thing that's left out here that I like to include is spiritual health. Because for many communities, spiritual health is quite important, right? I could take you to some of the communities I've been in Northern Ontario or remote Labrador, right, like Hopedale or Muskrat Dam or Satchko Lake or Pickle Lake or places like this, and those communities overwhelmingly would talk about their connectivity to spiritual practices or traditional cultural practices and include that in their definition of good health, right? So it's important when we talk to people and we look at people and ask them how their health is, we're thinking about all four of these things, right? And this idea that health is health, right? If you have poor mental health, then are you healthy? No, right? If you have excellent mental health but poor physical health, are you healthy? No, right? So this idea that health is health and that mental health is health. Of course, I mentioned the CMHA logo. I've turned off the sound because it makes a sparkle noise, and I hate that sparkle noise. Yeah.
Can you just go back to your question?
Absolutely.
Can you just explore a little bit more about the spiritual health?
Spiritual health, so that's different for everyone, right? So it's I come from an agnostic background. I'm not. I don't go to church regularly. My grandmother was a nun. Not a very effective nun, obviously, because I'm here. But it's so it's different for everyone, and it's important to, when we talk about health, when we talk about health of the individual, that especially if we're engaged in treatment, right, or we're engaged in community support, or we're engaged in working with individuals, that we get a sense of what good spiritual health means to them, right, and that our practices are culturally appropriate, right? So that we have an awareness of where this individual is coming from, and we're meeting them there instead of asking them to meet us where we are, right? Especially if we're community service providers. So good spiritual health is going to mean something different for everyone, right? It could mean religiosity, right? It could mean that they practice formal religion. It could be something separate from that, right? It could just be a way that they engage with their own personal moral or ethical codes, right? So it's going to differ based on the individual and the community you're working with. So with mental health works, we like to use a spectrum. And with this spectrum, you can kind of see it's a disc, right? And I want you to picture this disc as three-dimensional. And if this was a rotating top, a spinning top, right, and I was standing right in the center of it, so right above the fulcrum, would the disc wobble? No, right? If I'm standing on the fulcrum, the pin that's in the center of the disc that's spinning around like one of those child's toys, right? It's going to continue to spin. It's not going to wobble, right? And so we could call that balance, right? The disc is balanced. And so my definition of balance, what I like to describe as balance, that's that level 5 there. It's an arbitrary scale, by the way. It's not meant to, there's no clinical significance to that scale. It's absolutely arbitrary. I want you to understand that right away. Is that this is a feeling of in control, right? So I'm in control of my thoughts, my feelings, my body, right? I have relatively good control over my body. I can engage in the things I want to engage in. I feel confident, right? Confident in my social interactions, confident at work, confident in my relationships, confident in my position within society. Right? I feel secure. I have a home. I have food. I have relationships. I have people that care about me and people that I care about. I feel resilient, right? I feel like if something happens to me, I can bounce back from that and be okay, right? So this idea that, okay, let's say accounting buggers up and I don't get paid next week, I'll be okay to wait until the next paycheck, right? Or, if I experience an accident at work and I have to take a couple weeks off, I'll bounce back from that and I'll be okay, right? Or if I get in a fight with someone I love, I'm not worried about the relationship. I understand that that's just a fight, right? I'm able to bounce back from those feelings. That's what resiliency means to me. And finally, I'm involved, right? I'm involved in my community. I'm involved at work. I'm involved in my personal relationships. That's how I would describe balance. Would you include something different? Or something to add? Would you add something there?
So where's the meaningful life? You have a meaningful life.
Yeah, absolutely, right? So you take meaning out of life. I would personally probably include that in feeling confident, right? And secure, but absolutely you could throw having meaning in your life or in your work up there, that you could include that. What else? How do you describe balance for you?
Also, just to add something, because you just added to the previous logo that you put, the spiritual health.
Yeah.
But I would also just to have something that morality gets into the value and truth, because everybody has different morality, but it's based on the science that we can just bring it to the way of thinking that it's based on the truth and science.
Okay, so I think if I were to understand, I think I understand what you're saying. So if we're able to engage in a moral or ethical code, right, that treats other people as though we wish to be treated, that's a good sense of balance, right? Absolutely, that would be an indicator of good balance, right? Being in peace with yourself, right? Happy with what you have and happy with what you're doing. Absolutely, right? Yeah.
Having motivation.
Motivation, right? So, the get up and go attitude, like I'm going to attack today. I'm going to do something today that really matters to me, and do something that's really fun for me, right? Yeah.
Being flexible or being able to adapt.
Yeah, being flexible or able to adapt to change, absolutely, right? So that could be resiliency, but it could also be that maybe you understand that life is hectic, life is stressful, and sometimes you got to change tacks, right? And be flexible in your expectations and flexible in how you approach things. Absolutely. Right, so those are all excellent indicators of balance, right? And so when we talk about balance, and we're going to continually come back to balance throughout the day, it's important to understand what everyone's definition of balance is. Because if my definition of balance is going to be the same as yours, no, it's not, right? If you were to talk amongst your tables right now about what balance is, it would be different for each of you, right? You might have points of intersection or points that are shared amongst one another, but your definitions of balance are going to be very different, right? They're not going to be the same for everyone. On either side of this spectrum, right, and we'll talk about this more, we have crisis and we have affective disorder, right? And remember, it's three-dimensional, so it doesn't mean that it's a linear scale, right? It's a three-dimensional scale. And when we talk about affective disorder, we're talking about changes in mood or thinking, right? So traditionally, if we were to open up the DSM, or the current iteration of the DSM, we'd be taking a look at anxiety disorders and mood disorders. And we will talk about those later today. And then crisis, right, the experience of a crisis, right, which could mean multiple things. Again, we'll address those. Could be a panic attack, could be suicidal ideation or behaviors associated with suicide, could be self-harm, could be harmful substance use practices, whatever that definition of crisis is for that individual. And we'll discuss all that later on. So I've used terms kind of synonymously right now. I've talked about problems and I've talked about illnesses, right? Every mental illness is a mental health concern, right? But not all mental health concerns are mental illnesses. Right? So if you're feeling a lot of stress at work, right, and you're kind of like you get that anxiety rock in the middle of your chest. Have you all ever felt that way? Like there's a rock just right here. Is that necessarily a mental illness? No, it could just be a normal reaction to stress, right? If you watch a sad movie and you can't get it out of your head for a couple days, is that depression? No, right? But it could be a mental health concern. It could be that maybe you need to examine how you're feeling, right? So not all mental health concerns are going to be mental illnesses or meet the threshold for that, but all mental illness is obviously a mental health concern. And we look at changes in three things, and those three things are thinking, mood, and behavior. So what would an example of a change in thinking be in the context of a mental illness? Just in your own words. You don't have to read from the ICD or something like that. I'm not looking for that. Did I see his hand, or is that just a... Okay, so change in thinking. Yep, okay.
I think if the organization changes in these 3 years, then there is a reason to be concerned. Like you're talking about the Christmas.
How they're thinking, yeah.
They're thinking, well, if they're thinking change within maybe 3 days,
Good, so you're stuck on something. You can't get it out of your head, right? There's this feeling of stuckedness. Maybe you're having intrusive thoughts, right? So thoughts that feels as though they're just like coming out of left field, right? And you don't understand why you're having those thoughts, but they're appearing in your brain, right? There's not a path that you can connect those thoughts to. Maybe you're ruminating, right? You're engaging in maladaptive thought cycles, right? So you're constantly ruminating about something stressful or something that causes anxiety, right? More seriously, maybe you're experiencing formal thought disorder, right? In the context of something like schizophrenia or bipolar disorder. What about a change in mood? What would a change in mood look like? Yep.
Feeling sad, maybe isolated.
Yeah, feeling sad, isolated, for extended periods of time.
Losing
Right?
interest in.
Losing interest, right? The inability to feel pleasure or really feel anything. Right? It's a very common complaint when we speak to individuals that are experiencing poor mental health or mental illness. They'll say, I feel like a zombie, or I feel like a robot, or I feel like I'm just on autopilot, right? I don't take enjoyment out of things I normally take out of enjoyment, but I'm not like sad. It's not like I'm crying every day, right? That's something we hear often. What else? What would another change in mood look like? Yeah. Hopelessness, helpless, absolutely, right? So you see how mood and thought are connected, right? We call that a cognitive distortion, right? This idea that we're engaged in maladaptive thought patterns that start to affect our mood and how we feel, or our mood and how we feel starts to affect our thought patterns, right? So we've all done this before, regardless of whether or not we've maybe been diagnosed with a mental illness or a mental health concern. We've had a really crummy day, and that's going to dictate how we feel and think about everything else throughout the rest of the day, right? How many people here have snapped at someone they really shouldn't have snapped at? Like gotten angry with someone when they got home, or someone on the street, and you really regretted it later on? You're lying if you don't raise your hand. I'm telling you right now, right? Okay? How many people here have just gotten home and they've just cried, and they couldn't really pinpoint one thing as to why that was happening, but it's happened, right? And you're lying probably if you don't raise your hand and say it's never happened to you, right? So those are all things, right? Our mood can affect how we think, and how we think can really affect our mood. And finally, changes in behavior, right? And so I'm going to tell you right now, the only thing that you notice in your practices or in your organizations, whether it's with staff or clients, is a change in behavior. Because are we mind readers? Can we tell what people are thinking? No, right? We rely on what they tell us and how they're acting. Can we really tell how people are feeling? How many people here have laughed at a really inappropriate moment? Like someone got hurt and you laughed and you're like, oh my God, I can't believe I did that. Or you're at a funeral and you just burst out laughing, right? Or you're at a wedding and they say I do or whatever, and then you start laughing and you're like, oh my God, I can't believe I did that, right? So we've all had moments like that, right? Every time I watch the movie Philadelphia, I cry. And I don't know why, I've seen it like 20 times, but I think it's just Tom Hanks, and I just cry every time I see the movie Philadelphia. Doesn't mean that I'm depressed, doesn't mean that I'm really sad, it's just a reaction that I have. I don't know why. When I'm stressed, I yawn. I don't know why I yawn, but when I'm stressed, I yawn. So right, just because we're acting a certain way doesn't mean that that's a good indicator of how we're feeling, right? So the only thing that you rely on is behavior, right? So you look for indicators in behavior, and particularly you look for a change in behavior. So you look for a change in what that person is normally like. If Joe shows up to work every day and he's dressed appropriately for work, he's shaven because he normally shaves, he doesn't grow a beard, it looks like his hair is well kempt, it smells like he's showered, he always eats lunch at the same time, he always has a cup of coffee in the morning, he goes home at the same time every day. But then the next week Joe's showing up and he looks really disheveled, like he hasn't washed his clothes in a few days, it smells like alcohol. Are you going to think Joe is okay? No, right? You're going to probably maybe want to have a conversation with Joe. So we look for changes in behavior in order to indicate whether or not we're experiencing a mental health concern or a mental illness, right? And these thoughts, these feelings, these behaviors can be triggered or aggravated by something, right? So something that happens in our day-to-day lives can really aggravate how we're feeling or how we're thinking, right? And oftentimes we see unhelpful coping patterns. We had a bunch of stats at the beginning of the presentation. What I didn't include there is the rate of concurrent disorders. Does anyone here know what I mean when I say concurrent disorder? Yep, what does it mean?
It's when someone has mental illness and they also have addiction.
Yep. So someone who experiences a mental illness and at the same time is experiencing a substance use concern or an addiction. right? And the rate in Canada is very high. It's one of the highest in the OECD. It's about 40 to 60%. So 40 to 60% of individuals that experience mental illness will also experience a concurrent substance use concern at some point in time throughout that disease process. Right? Now that could be multiple things. It could be process related, right? So it could be engaging in harmful sexual practices or internet use or video games or self-harm, right? Or eating patterns or drinking too much or using too much pot or injecting opioids, right? It could be any of those things. But 40 to 60% of individuals we see have a concurrent substance use concern. And this is going to be associated with significant distress, right? If it wasn't associated with distress, then we wouldn't call it a mental health concern, right? It would just be normal, within 2 standard deviations of the mean. And other health problems. So there's a somatic component to mental illness. How many people here have been so stressed they felt like they were going to throw up, or have thrown up? Yeah? Or gotten the runs. You don't have to raise your hand for that one, right? But there's a somatic component to mental illness, right? We know that individuals that experience chronic stress, they experience higher rates of heart disease, right? You're more at risk of developing cancer, right? Just experiencing mental and cognitive stress, you're at a higher risk of developing certain chronic illnesses, right? Or exacerbating already existing ones like lupus, scleroderma, rheumatoid arthritis, stuff like that, right? How many people here have gotten a tension headache before? When they're really stressed at work or at home, right? They get that headache in the back of your neck and it's awful. Migraines, right? Aches and pains, and they can't really pinpoint why they're getting those aches and pains, right? Very common in depression. Right? And we talk about this being sustained over a period of time. So I want you to imagine you have a goldfish, Flippers, right? And Flippers passes away. He was a relatively elderly goldfish, lived for about 4 weeks. And you're a bit upset about Flippers passing away. So you decide to have a little funeral for him, right? So you make a little coffin out of paper towel or toilet paper, put him in the toilet, send him out to sea, you know, like the Vikings used to do. Bring in the bagpiper, he plays the lament, and then you hit flush and you're done, right? And the funeral's over. And the next day you go to the doctor, and the doctor's just, you know, you're just doing a regular checkup or getting some blood work done, and the doctor asks how you're doing. And you say, oh, you know what, I'm feeling kind of down. Flippers passed away. I got to go buy Flippers 2 at PetSmart today. And the doctor says, I have just the thing for you. Here is a 6-month prescription for Zoloft. What are you going to tell your doctor? Yeah, right? You're going to shake your head and go, no, I'm not seeing you again. So if we treated mental illness like that, people would be saying no, right? So we talk about something being sustained over a period of time, typically 3 to 4 weeks, right? So if you're feeling really down, if you're feeling like you have really low mood, or you're feeling depressed for 3 to 4 weeks, that's an indicator that something might be going on, right? But it's important to consider context. A death in the family, severance of a relationship, losing a home or losing a job is normal to feel down for extended periods of time, right? So factor in context when you think about these things, right? But typically sustained for 3 or 4 weeks. Does this make sense to everyone? Yeah? Okay. So we're going to do a quick exercise, and I'm going to make you uncomfortable and ask you to close your eyes. No, it's okay. I'm not going to make you uncomfortable, but I am going to ask you to close your eyes. Okay? And I want you to picture a lemon. Not a Ford Pinto, not the car, but like the fruit, right? Not many people are laughing at that, but for those born at a certain age, you'll know what a Pinto is. Picture the fruit at home on your countertop, right? On your table, counter, in your apartment, condo, house, wherever you live. And picture how yellow that lemon is, right? It's a ripe lemon. And I want you to take a knife now. Imagine taking a knife and cutting that lemon in half, bisecting it, right? What does that smell like? You know, when the zest, sprays up into the air, the minute you cut through the rind, and then you cut through the pulp, right? And now take a piece of that lemon and place it in your mouth. And imagine what the rind of the lemon tastes like, right? You know, that really bitter, tough taste, that texture. And what about the pulp of the lemon? The fruit part, right? It's kind of sweet but sour. And with your eyes still closed, how many of you start to salivate a little bit with me describing that lemon? Okay, you can open your eyes. So usually when I do this, and it's about the same here, 40 to 60% of people will raise their hands. Right? That's pretty incredible. That I can just describe a lemon, take 30 seconds, and you'll have a physical reaction. Right? That's pretty incredible, that I can do that just by describing something. And what that's demonstrating is that's demonstrating a process in the brain called emotional recall, and that process occurs particularly within the midbrain, and part of the midbrain called the amygdala. The amygdala is responsible for emotional memory and learning. It's responsible for our fight or flight response, right? It's responsible for regulating the limbic system and our parasympathetic nervous system. And so when I start talking about a lemon, and you start to get into that state of thinking about the lemon, right, if you're engaging in it, what starts to happen is your prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that's the monkey brain, you know, the part for logic, reasoning, language, all those things, it starts to shut down a little bit. It starts to deactivate. So if I were to throw you into an fMRI, I'd see it would start to turn blue in the fMRI, right? Because it's starting to deactivate a little bit. And then the midbrain, particularly the amygdala, is going to start to burn bright red because it's starting to activate. Think about the last time you bit into a lemon. How many people have seen those YouTube videos where the mother is like giving the baby the lemon and it's making this face, and it's like sometimes you really feel bad for the baby because you're like, oh no, you're not going to like that, buddy. But that's what's happening, right? The amygdala is starting to fire because the baby's going, oh no, I never want to do that again. It's the same idea as, you know, when I was a kid, I put a fork into an outlet and I shocked myself, and then I automatically was like, I'm not going to do that again. And about 5 minutes later, I was like, you know what, maybe if I do it this way, it's not going to happen. And I did it, and then I stopped doing it ever again. I've never put a fork in an outlet since then. But that's the amygdala firing, right? That's me learning not to put forks into outlets, right? So that's what's happening when I describe that lemon. And that's particularly important when we talk about vicarious trauma, secondary traumatic stress, or compassion fatigue, right? So what is vicarious trauma? Well, vicarious trauma is a disruption of what we call an individual schema. Has anyone heard of that before? An individual schema? Or schema, depending on how you want to pronounce it. So your schema or your schema is your perception of the world. The perception of how you interact with others in the world, how you interact with your environment, your relationships with other people. Kind of those unwritten rules that we all go through life believing in, right? So the minute we start to engage in our surroundings as children, as infants, and all the way through adulthood, we start to develop a sense of this is what the world is like. These are the rules that exist around the world, right? And we're quite privileged, those of us that have been born in Western societies, right, like Canada, the United States, particularly the people that look like me, we have a pretty comfy understanding of how the world works, right? Unless we've gone overseas and worked with particular communities or do community work, right? We have a particular understanding of how the world works, and that's a pretty nice understanding, right? Those are some pretty nice rules that exist for us. And the minute there's a rupturing or a severing of our perception of those rules, that's when trauma occurs, right? So vicarious trauma is this disruption of that schema, this disruption of our perception of how the world works, of those rules that exist within the world, right? And particularly our understandings of safety and control, right? So if we don't have control, or we feel as though we wouldn't have control in that situation, or be safe in that situation, those are particularly traumatic. Vicarious trauma or secondary traumatic stress occurs particularly when a practitioner or listener, right, so a clinician, a psychologist, a social worker, listens to a story and empathically engages with the talker, right? So starts to connect on an emotional and personal level with the talker. So what's an example of this? An example of this might be a nurse listening to a survivor of sexual assault, right? This might be a social worker working with someone who's experienced abuse, right? It could be you as a partner or as a spouse listening to your significant other describe a horrific crime, right? Or perhaps time spent in their home nation during a period of war, right? So we start to empathically engage with the talker, and we start to erode, right, that feeling of safety that exists within ourselves. Even if we've never experienced trauma before in our lives, but we're particularly at risk if we have experienced trauma, right? And these disruptions can be pervasive, right? So individuals who experience secondary traumatic stress will see the same 4-symptom cluster that an individual with PTSD would see. Okay? So they'll experience the same 4-symptom cluster, right? That's found within the DSM. And it's going to affect all aspects of their life, right? I heard a really great story. A few years back, I was out in Amsterdam for a conference, and I was presenting on the reintegration of child soldiers in West Africa, particularly the DDR process, the disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration. And there was a speaker there, and I had a chance to speak with him briefly, and he was talking about his experiences being a psychologist in New York State. And he had a practice. It was a pretty typical practice. It was like, people that have lost their jobs, kids that maybe parents are going through a divorce, simple like middle-class problems kind of practice. Maybe a few individuals that are experiencing something more severe, like substance use concern or schizophrenia. And then 9/11 happened, on September 11th. And he wasn't even in New York at the time. And overnight, when he started and he opened up his practice again, his entire psychological practice changed. Right? So he had firefighters, he had family members that had lost someone in the towers, he had family members that were still looking for people, right? And putting up posters. And he conducted this practice, this psychological practice, for many months. And about 6-8 months later, when he was walking into his foyer of his building, he was about on the 40th floor, I think, of the office building he was in. He couldn't get in the elevator. He had a panic attack. And the reason for that is because he had spent the last 6 to 8 months listening to the stories of individuals that had been around during September 11th, and he started to have a physical reaction. He understood that this was transference, right? I'm now experiencing secondary traumatic stress, and he had to take time off, right, and deal with that. But it's very real, and it's very common, right? Especially for those of you that are engaging in direct client care or direct client managing client relations, right? And sometimes these changes can be permanent, right? So it can be something that you will deal with the rest of your life, just like the case of post-traumatic stress disorder. So where do we place this on the spectrum? Well, it's, again, kind of arbitrary. We can place it on the far left corner, right? And if we were to say, 6 or 7, we're starting to have that conversation with that individual, what we might start to feel is that feeling in your chest, right? That tightening. Everyone felt that way before. It's like the muscles in their chest are starting to clench. It might feel like your stomach is starting to gurgle, or your digestive system is starting to suppress itself because you're starting to get really anxious, right? You might start to feel hyper-aroused, like you're looking for something in the environment that's threatening, right? You're looking for an exit. I'm sure we've all had conversations with someone where we thought, oh my God, I'm feeling really anxious, I want to know where the door is, right? That feeling is because, again, the amygdala is starting to fire, and it's telling you to either run away or fight something, right? So we're getting hyper-aroused. We're looking for that threat in our environment. We might feel overstimulated. So loud noises are going to be a lot louder and a lot more startling, right? Or if I were to throw you at the corner of Grosvenor and Yonge, it would feel like the cars, I think the speed limit is 30 kilometers an hour there, it would feel like the cars are going a lot quicker than they actually are, right? So we're overstimulated. Distractible, right? It's going to be hard to concentrate. Birds chirping outside, your attention might be drawn over there, or something moving out in the window of the corner of your eye, your attention might be drawn over there, right? So you can imagine feeling this way and trying to do work, like just do normal, like work at your office desk. Irritable, right? I'd ask the question, how many of you have snapped at someone when you really shouldn't have snapped at them, or like honked on the horn a lot when you were driving downtown Toronto? It seems like everyone in Toronto does that, but it's, you start to get really irritable, again, because it's that fight or flight response. And then finally, you might feel like you're electric, like your whole body is buzzing. Has anyone felt that way before? Yeah? So that's that stress hormone cortisol that's starting to flow through your parasympathetic nervous system, right? And what that stress hormone does is it gets you ready and all your muscles ready to start to fight or run away from something, right? So your muscles start to clench, you might start to twitch, you might start to feel like you got to move, right? And that's because your brain is telling your body that there's a tiger somewhere, right? And it's going to eat you, and you need to run away or fight the tiger. So if we exist long enough in that level 6 or 7, right, the disc, right? So let's say we put a foot all the way over at that 6 or 7, the disc now might start to wobble, right? And if it spends too long wobbling and it gets kind of off keel, it's going to tick. And that's when we move into crisis, right? It's that level 9. And crisis we can describe as maybe a panic attack, right? Has anyone ever had a panic attack before? Right? It's not fun. It's not pleasant. It's like running a marathon in 5 minutes. It's a miserable feeling. You might experience a break from reality, so you might even experience psychosis, right? So you might start to hear voices. You might start to have delusions of persecution, right? you might start to have suicidal ideation or thoughts, right? So you might think about ending your own life. And that's not just a response to depression, right? It's important to understand suicide as a response to pain, right? Especially cognitive or mental pain. And that's when people start to think about self-harm or suicide. And then finally, because your parasympathetic nervous system is so activated, instead some people's response is not depression, but the opposite of depression, right? So they enter into a manic episode. Any questions about that? Does that make sense? Yeah?
What would be an actual example for psychosis?
For psychosis? So typically we see this in individuals that have had a dysregulated mood or a dysregulated affective response for an extended period of time, right? A very typical one outside the context of something like schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder, bipolar disorder. Psychosis, let's say in the context of depression, they start to hear voices that are telling them really negative things, right? It could also be borderline in the sense that individuals that experience severe anxiety, right? Let's say severe hypochondria, they might start to really believe that they're ill, right? Instead of just the worry about being ill, they start to believe that they are ill, and then no matter what a doctor says, they believe they have cancer, right? And no one can tell them otherwise. Right, so that would be an example of a break from reality in the context of an affective disorder or something along the affective spectrum. It's rare to see, the typifying features of schizophrenia associated with anxiety or depression or a stress response. You wouldn't typically see formal thought disorder or stuff like that, aphasia, word salad, things like that. You wouldn't see that usually. Any other questions? So what changes when we talk about vicarious trauma or secondary traumatic stress? Well, worry goes up, right? We start to worry about the things we're hearing, right? We start to look behind us when we're walking home at night more often. We start to maybe lock the door when usually we wouldn't lock the door. We start to worry about driving home, whatever it might be, right? Whatever the trigger or the stress response is a result of. We start to feel really tired. And there's a reason for that. It's because we're not sleeping, right? Sleep is going down. And we're probably not eating well. Unlike with depression or low mood, when people have really fluctuating patterns of eating, right, and nutrition, some people eat too much, other people don't eat at all. Overwhelmingly, when people are experiencing stress and anxiety, they don't eat. And the reason for that is because your body is telling your stomach that it shouldn't be using up all that blood and all that oxygen to eat something, digest something. It's trying to pull all of that into the core to protect your organs in case that tide. So that's why our appetite tends to be suppressed and why we tend to throw up when we're really stressed, right? Or feel like we're going to get the runs because of that nervous system response. We're going to start to avoid the things that typically we would like to do, right? So if someone's been in a car accident and they're relaying their experience in that car accident and you start to have a stress response to that, you might avoid driving your car. Or you might avoid going to certain restaurants if someone's experienced a crime in those restaurants and you're talking to them regularly, right? Or you might not get on a plane when a family member is telling you about a plane crash, right? These are all typifying examples of avoidance. You're going to start to get intrusive thoughts. Does everyone know what I mean when I say intrusive thoughts? Those are the thoughts that we have that we're like, where did that come from, right? And they're typically very scary and very disconcerting, right? Because there's not a pattern that we can follow. Why those thoughts are starting to pop up in our head, right? So intrusive thoughts might be something like, you're going to die if you do that, or something bad is going to happen, right? And typically our concentration suffers, our sleep is suffering, right? Because we're anxious, we're stressed, it's difficult to sleep, and our energy starts to plummet. So we're just exhausted, right? Being in a constant state of stress or anxiety is an exhausting process. What are the risk factors? Well, obviously stress, right? So if you're experiencing high levels of stress in your work, and you're working with clients regularly that have experienced trauma, you are at a higher risk of developing secondary traumatic stress, right? If you've experienced trauma yourself, right? So for many of us that work in whether it's mental health or community service, particularly organizations that work with immigrants and newcomers, many people have also experienced trauma, right? It's the reason why you got into the work that you got into, or why we got into the work that we got into. And that means that we're at a higher risk, right? Because we've already experienced an injury. It's like breaking your hand, right? First time you break it, it's easier to break it a second time. And finally, sustained contact, right? If your entire practice is engaging in survivors of trauma, you're at a very high risk of developing secondary traumatic stress or at the lower end compassion fatigue, right? My partner, when we lived out in New Brunswick, was the sexual assault response coordinator for the university in Fredericton. And her practice pretty much consisted of two things. She was a counselor, a mental health counselor, and it was women who were experiencing eating disorders and survivors of sexual assault. And every day, for 9 hours a day, would be talking to women with eating disorders, which overwhelmingly have the highest rate of death of all the mental illnesses, right? And survivors of sexual assault. And it got to the point where she was going on stress leave constantly because of how traumatic it was, right? And what they ended up doing in the counseling services practice was they ended up having a rule that if you were speaking to someone that was a survivor of trauma, you had to put a block in your calendar to go and talk to another social worker or psychologist at the counseling services in order to ensure that you could start to decompress, right? And because if you're constantly doing that, it's like going to the gym and just bench pressing for hours on end, right? Is that going to be conducive towards your physical health? Are you going to get better at bench pressing? No. You're going to tear something, right? There's going to be a traumatic injury that occurs, right? You can't constantly just go into the gym and bench press and expect there to be good results from that, right? There's going to be some pretty maladaptive or bad results because of that. So when we talk about sustained contact, that's what we're talking about, right? It's important to engage and look at the kind of practices that we have. Treatments, pretty common, are obviously psychotherapy, right? Particularly the psychotherapies that would be engaged in for post-traumatic stress disorder. So things like cognitive behavioral therapy is pretty much the panacea that everyone thinks is the best. A version of cognitive behavioral therapy is dialectical behavioral therapy. Some of you might have heard about that. EMDR, right? Motivational interviewing to some extent. Certainly peer support groups. Mindfulness techniques, right? This is less a treatment for it and more preventative steps that you can take, right? Because you can't just expect, read about a mindfulness technique and then the minute you start to feel secondary traumatic stress or traumatic stress, think, okay, I'm going to do that thing I read about 8 weeks ago or a year ago. It's not going to work, right? It's like saying I'm going to go for a marathon today and you've never run more than 2 kilometers in your entire life, right? It's not going to be a good time. I wouldn't recommend doing that. And then finally, medication. So typical medications, right? SSRIs, so selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, SNRIs. Rare to see people have to take neuroleptics, but they are prescribed sometimes. Really common is benzodiazepines, right? So Valium, lorazepam, clonazepam, those quick-acting anxiolytics that help bring you down from that acute state of anxiety. Any questions about that? No? Pretty straightforward? Yeah? Clear as mud for some people? So, what does vicarious trauma look like? We're going to do a quick exercise, but rather than talk about what it looks like, we're going to do a listening exercise. This is going to preface the rest of the day. So I'm going to hand out to each table a picture. Okay? Like this. And you're going to break off into pairs, and if there's not enough pictures to go around, it's okay. You can just draw a picture that looks something like this. So a simple geometric pattern, right? I don't want it to be very complex. And you're going to turn your backs to one another, okay, in pairs. And one person is going to be the reader, and one person is going to be the drawer. And what I want you to do is I want the drawer to draw whatever they're being told to draw, and the reader to explain the picture to the drawer. But the reader is not allowed to do certain things. So the reader can't say, draw a circle here. Okay? The only thing that you can say is start with your pen on this point of the paper and draw a line or an arc or whatever for this long, and then stop, and then do something. Do you understand what I'm saying? So you can't say it's a star and then the person draws a star, right? Or you can't say it's a circle with 2 smaller circles and a smile in it, and then it's obviously a happy face, right? Or an ice cream cone, depending on how you perceive that. So, sound good? Everyone got a good idea of what we're doing? Okay, perfect. So we're going to take 5 minutes. I'm going to hand these out quickly. If you don't get one, that's okay. Just make sure that you draw something on a piece of paper and the person who's drawing for you can explain that. So don't be really mean and draw like a cat and expect to draw a cat. Draw. Reader? So we'll take 3 more minutes, wrap up your drawings. If you're done, you can share them. You're either so how many people are done? Only a few, so people are still drawing? Say again?
They saw the shape.
Oh, they saw the shape? You can just draw something. I don't have any more sheets, but you can draw your own shape.
Okay.
And so we're going to wrap up in 2 minutes. Okay, if you don't finish. Okay, so we can just turn inward and stop there. So, how many people were drawers? How many people were drawing? Raise your hand. Yeah, so who was drawing right now? So we're just going to stop the exercise. I know some people won't be done, but we're going to stop, so you've got to move on. So how many people are drawing? Sorry, raise your hands again. Okay, so how difficult was it? Very difficult, yeah? Very easy. Oh, okay. Yeah, okay. So you had a good, you had a good speaker. You were able to listen and, okay. Who found it difficult? Did anyone find it difficult, or is everyone here a little bit difficult? Yeah. Right. So even there's a modicum of difficulty here, right? And the drawings that were handed out are pretty simple. It's not like I was asking you to draw a cat or a platypus or a flying squirrel or something like that, right? I was asking you to draw a star or a happy face or a bolt of lightning, I think was one of them, a moon or a crescent moon. So relatively simple pictures that are still a bit difficult to listen to and say, what are they trying to get me to do here, right? And so you can imagine if someone is just trying to explain a picture to you, how much more difficult it would be for that person to describe how they're feeling, right? Especially if you've never felt that way before. Right? So actually sitting down with someone and having them describe anxiety to you, what that feeling feels like. If you've ever experienced anxiety, is it easy to put it into words? No, right? Or depression, is it easy to put depression into words? No, right? So just being able to talk and for the listener to be able to hear what they're saying and actually create a mental picture of that can be quite challenging, especially for individuals that have never experienced a mental health concern before or don't have the same cultural background as the individual that is expressing that mental health concern. Right? Because the language that we use around mental illness in Canada is not culturally malleable. Right? It's just not. So the diagnostic criteria, whether it's the ICE or the DSM, cannot be transplanted into a country very easily. That first of all, English is not the first language. That is not predominantly Christian, right? And doesn't have the same way of life as us. Those descriptors of certain mental illnesses are not going to be accurate, right? And not going to be relevant. So it's important to be able to engage in a listening process and practice that's culturally attuned, right? And in mental health works, we like to use 3 steps. Okay, we call them the 3 gears. And the first gear, I want you to picture this is like a car driving down the highway. The first gear is noticing, intentional noticing. And what you're doing there is you're noticing a shift in that person's baseline. So a change in how they normally act and think and behave. Right? Once you've noticed that and you start to have a conversation with them, you shift into second gear, right? So you're picking up speed now. And this is listening for awareness. This is active listening. And not just listening for awareness, right? But also listening to make sure that you get all the information that they're trying to tell you. Right? So not just nodding your head, right? So we've all probably taken training at some point on active listening skills, right? Where they tell you not to cross your arms, have open body posture, and nod your head, and parrot what the other person is saying. Like, so you're saying this. Oh, yeah, okay, I get that. You're saying this, right? That's all well and good, but if you're not actually listening to the person, all you're doing is mimicking them, right? And you're not actually listening. We've probably all done that before, where we're just nodding our heads and saying, like, when's the conversation going to end? I got stuff to do. We've all done that before. It's really important that we don't just do that when we're working with individuals that might be experiencing a mental health concern, right? If they're ready and willing to open up to you, and you start to develop a picture of what's going on, you can shift into third gear. This is collaborating or working together. And this means working together in order to potentially either correct the problem if it's existing in the workplace or the work setting, or at least support the person in the work setting as they get help elsewhere, right? Finally, if the person is in crisis, you pull over to the side or the shoulder of the road, you put the vehicle into park, and you address the crisis. Right? And we'll talk about some of the skills that you use there in a moment. So the first, intentional noticing. It means paying attention to an individual's stress response or exposure to trauma on purpose. Right? So how many here would characterize their work environment as a work environment that is exposed to stories of trauma? You can raise your hands. Yeah. So a good chunk of you, right? So some of the people that you work with, or a majority of the people that you work with, depending on the type of organization, is an organization in which you're hearing stories of trauma. Right? And I would argue that the process of moving one's home and country is traumatic in and of itself, in some way, shape, or form. Right? So I think many people in this room experience stories of trauma, at least on a semi-regular basis. So it's important to pay attention to that on purpose, right? To understand that that's your starting point, that you will, in the course of your work, hear stories of trauma, right? To not say, okay, no one's experiencing that, or it's not a regular thing in the office or in our workplace. No, it's at least a semi-regular thing, right? And it means establishing a day-to-day baseline with your staff if you have direct reports, right? Or with your coworkers if you're a staff member, Right? So what does that mean? Well, the minute that I walked into the room and I was standing up here because I couldn't sit anymore, I spent most of my morning sitting, and I was standing here and I was looking at people as they came in and how you were acting, I immediately, without even knowing your name, started to establish a baseline with you. Right? I don't know your name, but I can see how you're acting. Right? How you're talking to people. Are you sitting by yourself? Or are you kind of like collecting people and you're a social butterfly and people are just flocking to you? Or were you sitting by yourself in the corner, just sipping your coffee, sending an email off or something like that? I'm automatically establishing a baseline. The minute I started to speak, you started to establish a baseline for me. Right? We do it automatically, but it means doing it on purpose now with our staff. Right? Understanding how our staff show up to the office every day, understanding how they work every day, how they act every day. Right? And noticing when that behavior changes significantly. Okay? Because that's an indicator that that person is not doing well. Does this mean that if you know that, let's say, Sally recently experienced a death in the family, that you go up to her and say, hey, Sally, I know you just experienced your grandmother passing away a couple days ago. I think you're depressed. No, you don't go up and say that to Sally, right? So you have to consider the context of this, right? It's normal for people to experience sadness and happiness, like severe ecstatic happiness, right? They just won the lottery or whatever. So consider the context for that shift in baseline, right? This means starting the conversation about vicarious trauma, right? So, hey, I've noticed that your workload's really increased, and I know that some of the clients that you're working with or have been working with recently are refugees. Can you tell me how you're feeling, right? Because I've noticed a change. Or, hey, I'm wondering, are we putting too much on your plate right now? Because you've got a couple of pretty high priority clients that are in crisis at the moment, and I'm wondering if we need to take a step back and maybe manage your workload a bit better, right? So starting the conversation that way, and using I statements, not using accusatory statements like I think you're sick, or I think you're ill, or I think you're experiencing traumatic stress. Don't do that. Say, hey, I've noticed this is a change in behavior, and I'm wondering if we can talk about this more, right? So use I statements. So with this in mind, what are some things we might be looking for in the context of secondary traumatic stress, compassion, fatigue? What are some behavioral changes that we might be looking for?
Late to work.
Late to work, good. Yeah, absolutely. Especially if the person is never late for work. What else? Yeah.
As a client missing appointments.
If a client's missing appointments, absolutely. What else? Forgetful, like they seem preoccupied or forgetting things, yeah. What else? Yeah.
Would be less energy and motivation.
Less energy and motivation, absolutely, right? So let's say you're working with a client regularly, and all of a sudden you're not doing things you normally like to do, right? Or someone that you know who's been working with a client regularly isn't going for coffee with you anymore. Or they play soccer on the weekends and they're no longer playing soccer, right? They've stopped playing soccer. Or maybe if you have a client, this is more in the context of post-traumatic stress, right? Because the client would be the person who's experienced it potentially. The client is no longer looking for a job, even though they were really keen to be looking for a job a week ago or 2 weeks ago, right? What else? I got my back turned, but you can shout it out. Anything? Yep. Sorry, say again? I'm just daily routine change. Yeah. So, could you give an example?
Eating disorder, sleeping disorder.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. So, major changes in how that person goes about their day, right? Whether it's how they eat, how they sleep, the kind of exercise they engage in, the kind of social relationships they have. What else?
Increased irritability.
I'm going to put something a bit more severe. Angry. Okay? Very common for individuals experiencing traumatic stress to have concerns with anger, especially men. Okay? I hate to say it, but one of our first reactions to any type of stress is to get angry about it. And then we'll get sad about it later on. Right? But, punching a wall is usually our first reaction, or breaking something, or yelling at someone, right? That's usually the first reaction that we see, especially in adult men. What else?
Negative one, negative.
Sorry, negative.
Negative on anything instead of looking at what do you call it? The glass of water is full or is empty. So always looking at the empty side instead of.
Yeah. So we call those cognitive distortions, right? Everything is negative. You catastrophize, right? Oh, I'm going to get on a plane tomorrow because I have to go somewhere for work. It's going to crash. Planes always crash, right? I've had dreams about the plane crashing. That's an example of a cognitive distortion. Yeah.
I don't know if it's sadness, because if you are a worker and you with a vulnerable group or like people who have lots of mental issues, sometimes if you have one client, but if you have 10 clients or more, just like it's going to affect you in a way because of.
Yeah, absolutely. Sadness, right? It's a lot sometimes. Isolation. So you start to disconnect from people. Absolutely. And I know no one can read my handwriting. I'm well aware of that. It's more for me than for you. I'm being facetious, but I know my handwriting's bad. Yeah?
Under the change of daily routine, it might affect your appetite, it might affect your daily activities, engagement, associated involvement with your social network in many other ways that you used to be.
Absolutely, right? So you've noticed in the last 3 minutes that we've come up with 8 to 10 things just off the top of our heads, thinking about it, like just taking a second to think about, okay, what are some things that we might be noticing, right? And we're going to approach and talk about this throughout the entire day, because it's the same process that you use regardless of what it is. Because are you clinicians? Is there a clinician in the room, by the way? Social worker, doctor, psychiatrist? Yeah? Okay, so we have a couple, but for the most part, you're not clinicians, right? Which means that your job is not to diagnose what's going on, it's just to understand maybe where that person is at, right? So the process that you use is the same. You're not diagnosing them with depression or post-traumatic stress disorder or anxiety disorder like GAD or phobia, right? All you're doing is you're using a process in order to meet them where they're at and to ensure that they're safe, right? So once you've started to establish this baseline, you've noticed a shift in the baseline, you can start to actively listen, right? And this means, first of all, building safety, validation, and clarity. It takes courage to talk about a mental health concern. Full stop. Whether you're a woman, a man, whether you're a child, an adult, whether you're a worker or a client, it takes a lot of courage to talk about a mental health concern, especially if it's in the workplace. Okay? So meet them there and say, I'm really happy you're talking to me. I understand how much courage it takes to do this. I want you to feel safe talking to me about this. Right? Meet them there right away so they understand this is okay. Right? Some things that you can say are thank you for being so open. Right? I want to learn more. I want to know more. Right? Don't just say, yeah, I get how you're feeling. I took a 3-hour session the other day. I understand it entirely. Right? I'm an expert. No, let them talk to you about their experience. Right? Active hearing, it means that you're actually seeking out understanding, not just listening to them and taking notes. Right? You're seeking to understand how they're interacting with the environment that they're currently in, whether it's the work environment or the client-provider relationship. Right? And also seeking out and understanding whether or not there's something about the environment you're currently in that are causing these feelings. Because maybe it's a process-related thing, or maybe it's an environmental-related stressor. Right? Maybe it's something about where you're meeting them, if they're a client, that's causing this reaction. Right? Or if it's a worker, maybe it's something